I thought I was being a good daughter-in-law when I accepted those apples. They came in a battered plastic bag, sagging under the weight of bruised, rotting fruit. And I smiled, thanked her, and quietly threw them away the moment she left the kitchen. I had no idea that bag was the opening move in a game she had been planning for months. A game where the prize was my house, my savings, and everything I had spent 6 years building from nothing. Then the second blow landed, the way second blows always do, harder than the first, and from a direction you never saw coming. It wasn't just that Margaret had brought rotten apples and expected gratitude. It was that while I was standing at my kitchen sink, rinsing the sticky residue from my hands, she was at my dining room table with a folder of documents she had no business carrying. Documents that had my name on them, my signature on them, and not a single word I had ever agreed to say. Let me take you back to the beginning. The beginning always matters. My name is Claire, and 6 years ago I moved to this city with 2 suitcases, a nursing degree, and the kind of stubborn optimism that only survives when it hasn't been tested yet. I worked double shifts at Mercy General until my feet stopped hurting at night, or rather, until I stopped noticing that they hurt. I ate rice and canned tomatoes more evenings than I care to count. I picked up overtime on holidays. I said no to vacations, to new clothes, to everything that was not a direct investment in the future I was building. By the time I met Daniel, I had managed to save enough for a down payment on a house. Not a large sum. The housing market was brutal, the kind of brutal that teaches young people to rent forever. But enough for a small, solid house in a neighborhood just beginning to come alive again. 2 bedrooms, a kitchen with original tile that I loved, a backyard with an old apple tree that dropped fruit every September in a stubborn, generous abundance. I bought it on my own. My name was the only name on the deed. That mattered to me then. It matters more to me now, looking back, because it was the one thing Margaret could never fully explain away, the inconvenient, legally documented fact that she had never been invited into what she had already decided was hers to arrange. Daniel came into my life the following spring, introduced by a mutual friend at a birthday party. He was warm, funny, disarmingly honest. He told me within the first 20 minutes that he was close to his mother, maybe too close, and laughed as though he were joking. I laughed too. I filed it under charming self-awareness and ignored the part of my brain that flagged it as something to revisit. We dated for 2 years. He moved in after 18 months. He proposed on a Tuesday evening in February while we were making pasta, and I said yes before the question was fully formed, because I had known for a long time that he was the person I wanted beside me. Our wedding was small and imperfect and completely us. 40 people, a borrowed venue, wildflowers in mason jars I'd filled myself at 5 a.m. in my dressing gown, while the kitchen smelled of damp stems, and the beginning of something. I was genuinely, uncomplicatedly happy. I want to say that clearly because it will matter later. Before all of it, there was real happiness. And that is what made it all so hard to lose. Margaret had been a presence in our relationship from the beginning, a gravitational one, pulling steadily from the edges without ever doing anything you could point to directly. She was a short, carefully dressed woman in her early 60s, silver hair and a tight chignon, the kind of posture that said she had been told all her life to sit up straight and had long since made it instinct. She brought casseroles. She called Daniel on Sunday evenings for exactly 45 minutes. She had referred to me, for the first year, exclusively as Danny's friend, long past the point where that term made social sense. And even after she began using my name, she said it with a particular lightness, as though she hadn't fully committed to keeping it. Her daughter Tanya, Daniel's younger sister, was perpetually between jobs, perpetually in financial crisis, perpetually described by Margaret as going through a temporary rough patch, with a certainty that had apparently not wavered in a decade. Margaret had been supplementing Tanya's mortgage for years. Daniel had mentioned it once, in passing, as though it were simply weather. I noted it. I did not yet understand what it would mean for me. The apple incident happened in October, 14 months after our wedding. Margaret arrived unannounced on a Saturday, surveyed the backyard with that particular appraising attention she gave to things she was calculating the value of, and reappeared at the kitchen door 20 minutes later with a large plastic bag full of apples she'd collected herself. The ones I had deliberately left on the ground, split-skinned, browning at the cores, already claimed by wasps. She set the bag on my counter with the small smile of someone who has contributed something useful. I looked at the dark bruising through the plastic, the soft decay already sweetening toward rot. I smiled. I said, "Thank you, Margaret." I made tea, served shortbread on a white plate, listened to her talk about Tanya's job search. And when she excused herself upstairs, I stood at my counter staring at those apples and felt something I couldn't name land in my chest like a stone dropped into still water. Something is not right here. I didn't know what it was yet, so I threw the apples away and told myself I was being uncharitable. The questions began in November. Small ones at first, easily deflected, the kind you can almost convince yourself are innocent. "What did you pay for the house originally, Claire? Danny mentioned you got a good price." She asked it over Sunday dinner, eyes on her plate, tone entirely casual, as though inquiring about the weather. I told her the price. Something about the way she asked made refusal feel like rudeness, and I had spent too long in this family working very hard not to be rude. "And the mortgage is nearly paid off now, isn't it?" She speared a piece of carrot. "Danny mentioned you've been very disciplined about it." I glanced at Daniel. He was looking at the table, not distracted, not thoughtful, but deliberate, the way you look at a fixed point when you are actively trying not to look somewhere else. I noted it. I changed the subject to Margaret's garden, which she loved to talk about, but the questions kept evolving, each month a measured step further. In December, whether I'd ever considered renting out the second bedroom for extra income. In January, whether families shouldn't pool resources in moments of genuine need, delivered while she wore the expression of someone introducing a perfectly reasonable philosophical position. In February, a real estate listing left on my kitchen counter without comment. A 2-bedroom across the city, priced below market, set there like a stone in a stream to see how the current moved. I moved it straight to the recycling bin, without a word. She never mentioned it. She didn't need to. What troubled me more than the questions, though, was Daniel. He was changing in ways I found difficult to name because the changes were small and accumulative, the kind you can explain away one by one, but cannot explain away all at once. More distracted, quicker to take phone calls behind closed doors, using a tone with me that had become careful and assembled in a way it had never been before. Not cold, not unkind, but constructed, as though he was thinking about each sentence before releasing it. We had been the kind of couple who left half-thoughts trailing because the other person would always complete them. That ease was eroding, and I noticed it the way you notice a slow leak. Not in any single moment, but in the growing sense that something underneath was no longer holding the way it should. In March, I found the browser history. I was not looking for it. We shared a laptop occasionally. Mine was at the hospital for a software update, and I needed to access a work file. The previous session was still cached. The page that loaded before I could navigate away was a government property information site, the kind you visit when trying to understand the legal mechanics of transferring real estate ownership. My hands went still on the keyboard. I scrolled up. The search terms were still visible. How to transfer house ownership to spouse. Can a wife's property be transferred without her direct consent? Property transfer requirements, primary residence. I closed the browser. I sat at the kitchen table and watched the afternoon light move through the window above the sink, and I told myself the most human thing I could. There is an explanation. He was researching for someone else. It doesn't mean what you think it means. And yet my hands were cold in a way that the warm April afternoon had no business producing. The warmth I had been carrying through the winter, the ordinary, domestic warmth of a life I had built, room by room, had developed a draft that I could no longer pretend was coming from outside. I said nothing that evening. I watched his face over dinner. He looked normal. He looked like my husband. That was the most frightening thing, that if he was part of something terrible, he was doing it without a single visible crack. The discovery happened on a Wednesday in April when a canceled staff meeting sent me home 2 hours early. I want to describe it the way it actually happened, not as a clean cinematic revelation, but as a layered unfolding, each stage worse than the last, like opening a series of doors only to find the last one opens onto nothing at all, just the cold, empty space where trust used to live. I came through the front door and registered 2 things at once: the silence of an empty house and Margaret's perfume. Not faint residue, the concentrated, present-tense reality of someone who had been here within the last hour. Floral, powdery, belonging to a different decade. It raised the hair on my arms before I understood why. She had been here. Today. Alone. In my house. On a Wednesday afternoon when she knew I was supposed to be at work. In the kitchen, her blue-rimmed teacup on the counter, the one she had brought herself and which I kept in the back of the cabinet because it was the only cup she'd use, and a plate with 3 shortbread crumbs. My shortbread, my kitchen, my house, entered without my knowledge. In the dining room, a cream-colored folder on the table, sitting at my end, my chair, as though placed there deliberately for me to find, or forgotten in someone's hurry to leave. My hands were steady when I picked it up. I remember that specifically because it wouldn't last. The first page was a letter, typed, signed in a signature I recognized immediately as mine, or a version of mine. The loops were right, the forward lean was right, the way the C in Claire curled back on itself. But there was a practiced smoothness to it that my real signature, written quickly in the flow of daily life, never had. My actual signature has a small gap between the C and the L when I write fast. This one was unbroken and perfect and wrong in a way I felt in my stomach before I could name it in words. I sat down slowly, the way you sit when your legs have made a decision your mind hasn't caught up to yet. I read the letter again. It was a letter of intent addressed to a real estate attorney named Robert Calloway, signed by Claire Ellen Marsh, my full legal name, expressing my clear and voluntary intention to transfer 50% ownership of the property at 14 Sycamore Drive to my husband, Daniel Andrew Marsh, with the understanding that this would facilitate a financial arrangement with his sister, Tanya Marsh, listed as a co-beneficiary in any subsequent refinancing. The date? 3 weeks ago. I pressed both palms flat on the table. I heard the clock in the hallway, a car on the street, my own breathing becoming very deliberate, the way breathing becomes when the body has understood something the mind is still refusing to accept. The second page, a financial summary, Tanya's mortgage, 3 years of payment history, current arrears, total outstanding balance, and a projected figure for clearing the debt entirely, $87,400. Written at the bottom, in a handwriting I knew as well as I knew my own, C's equity covers this with room. C, not Claire, not my daughter-in-law, just C. I was a variable in someone else's calculation. The person who had worked every holiday and eaten canned tomatoes for 5 years and built this house from nothing. I was simply C, and C's equity covered this with room. The third page was a draft refinancing proposal. My house, remortgaged, with Daniel and Tanya listed as co-owners, the equity extracted in a lump sum, the new monthly payments, substantially larger, calculated on 2 incomes, mine and Daniel's. Because I was the stable one, the reliable one, the one whose name would guarantee the loan, while the house I had sacrificed for was quietly redistributed around me as though I were furniture. Then I heard Daniel's key in the front door. The sound moved through me like electricity, sharp and immediate, reorganizing everything. I did not stand. I did not call out. I sat at the head of my table with my palms pressed flat on either side of that folder and listened to him come in, drop his keys, call my name with mild surprise at finding the lights on. I listened to his footsteps cross the kitchen. I listened to the pause, that specific quality of silence that means someone has registered something unexpected and is deciding how to respond. Then he appeared in the doorway. He saw me. He saw the folder. He saw my face. The color left him in a single visible wave from his forehead down through his jaw, and he stood absolutely still and said nothing at all. "Sit down," I said. My voice was quiet, completely level. I had not known until that moment that I was capable of that particular kind of quiet. Not the quiet of calm, but the quiet of something that has passed through shock and grief and arrived somewhere colder, clearer, and infinitely more dangerous. He sat down. He sat with his hands in his lap, looking at the folder, and I watched him decide what version of events to offer me. I could see it happening, the small working of his jaw, the way his eyes moved from the folder to the table to the middle distance, searching for a frame, an angle, a story that would make all of this somehow manageable. I had loved that face for 4 years. I had watched it across breakfast tables and hospital waiting rooms and the front seats of cars on long drives with the windows down. I knew every version of it. I had never seen this one before, the version that was deciding how much of the truth it could afford to give me. "Where did you find that?" he said finally. His voice was careful, quieter than usual, and more precise. "On the dining room table, where your mother left it." He closed his eyes, a single involuntary flinch, as though the words had landed somewhere physical. Then he opened them and looked at me, and what I saw in his face was not the guilt I had been bracing for. It was something more complicated and, in a way, worse. It was relief. The relief of someone who has been carrying a secret for a long time and has just been relieved of its weight, regardless of the cost to the person standing in front of him. "I was going to tell you," he said. "When?" My voice stayed exactly where it was, flat, level, somewhere below anger. "After the paperwork was filed? After my signature, which is not my signature, was already on a legally binding document submitted to an attorney? I didn't know she was going to draft documents. I didn't know she was going to forge my signature." The word landed in the room and stayed there. His hands, which had been open in his lap, slowly closed. "I didn't know about the signature," he said. "I swear to you I didn't know she had done that. But you knew about the plan, the refinancing, using the equity from my house to pay off your sister's debt. My house, Daniel, the one I bought before I ever met you, with my name on the deed, with my down payment, with my years of double shifts and missed holidays and dinners of rice and canned tomatoes, because I was saving every cent I had." "It's our house," he said softly, reflexively, and then, seeing my face, he stopped. "No," I said, "it is my house, my name, my down payment, my sacrifice, and you let your mother draw up plans for it, for months, and said nothing to me. You were trying to make it work for your mother and your sister, using something that belongs entirely to me, and you didn't think I needed to be consulted because you were going to manage it? Present me with a solution already designed around me without ever including me?" He said nothing. In the silence, I could hear the refrigerator humming in the kitchen and the distant sound of a neighbor's dog, and I thought, this is what the end of trust sounds like. Not a shout, not a slammed door, just a refrigerator and a dog and a man looking at a table. He reached across and put his hand over mine, the gesture of someone trying to de-escalate, someone who still, astonishingly, believed this was a conversation rather than a reckoning. I moved my hand away, slowly, deliberately, without anger. "Call your mother," I said. "Tell her to come here, tonight." Margaret arrived 40 minutes later. She came through the front door in her coat and her careful posture, carrying the composed expression of someone who had used every minute of the drive to arrange her face into the appropriate shape. She sat down across from me, folded her hands on the table, and looked at me with the patient, pained concern of a doctor about to deliver difficult news to someone she genuinely cares about. "Claire," she said, "I can see you're upset. Tell me about Robert Calloway." A small pause, barely perceptible. "He's a real estate attorney. You thought you'd contact an attorney using a letter bearing my forged signature, without my knowledge, without my consent." I spoke in the same level tone I had maintained since Daniel came through the door. "That is document fraud, Margaret." She unfolded her hands and refolded them. "I think you're being—" "Tell me when it started." "The situation with Tanya has been going on for years. You know that." Her voice acquired the texture of someone producing genuine feeling on demand. "I have been carrying it alone, Claire, for years, and I simply wanted to find a solution, for all of us. We are a family. I thought that if I organized everything clearly, you would understand. You would see it was the sensible thing." "The sensible thing," I said, "would have been to ask me." She held my gaze. "You would have said no." The silence after that was absolute. Even Margaret seemed to hear what she had just said, because something shifted in her expression, a fraction of exposure quickly covered. But I had seen it. She had said the quiet part aloud, and there was no taking it back. "So the plan," I said slowly, "was to make the decision for me, to use my property, my equity, my financial future to solve a problem that has nothing to do with me, and to present it as a fait accompli, with my signature already on the documents, so that by the time I found out, it would be easier to comply than to fight it." "That is a very uncharitable reading. Is it inaccurate?" She looked at me, her jaw tightened by the smallest visible degree. And then the second blow arrived, not from Margaret, but from Daniel. From the way he suddenly said from the doorway, "Mom, stop!" Not to defend me, because there was something else, something he could see approaching that I couldn't. I looked at his face and understood immediately. The folder was not the whole story. I reached under the refinancing draft and found a page folded in thirds. I opened it. A bank statement. A joint account I had never seen, bearing both Daniel's name and mine, Claire Ellen Marsh. My full name on an account I had never opened, never signed for, never known existed. Opening date, 8 months ago. Balance, $4,200, deposited in regular monthly increments of $525, beginning the month after our wedding anniversary. "Our household account," I said carefully. "We each put in $500 a month for expenses. We have done that since we got married." I looked at Daniel. "This is a different account, also in my name. Where is this money coming from?" Silence. "You have been taking money from our household account and redirecting it into a separate account, in my name, so that if anyone questioned the source, it would look like my contribution, that your mother has access to." The change in my voice was small but absolute. "For 8 months. That is identity fraud. That is theft. The forged signature is document fraud, and I have every piece of evidence I need sitting on this table right now." Margaret stood. When she spoke again, the softness was entirely gone, replaced by something harder and more honest, something I suspected had been there all along, simply waiting. "You would destroy this family, over property, over $4,000, over a letter that was never submitted to anyone." "The letter was never submitted," I said. I stood. I was slightly taller than her. She did not step back, but something in her recalibrated. "But it exists, and it bears my forged signature, and you brought it to my house today and you left it on my table." A pause, just long enough to land. That was a mistake. I excused myself upstairs and called Rachel, who had been a paralegal for 11 years and who answered on the second ring at 8:30 on a Wednesday evening, because she is the kind of person who answers calls at 8:30 on Wednesday evenings. I told her everything in order: the folder, the letter, the forged signature, the hidden account. She was quiet for a moment, and then she said, with a clarity that I found steadying, Photograph every page right now before you go back down. Time-stamped. Send them to me and to yourself. Call Patricia Hollis in the morning. I'll send you her number tonight. Don't sign anything. Don't agree to anything. And do not let them leave with that folder. I photographed every page, clearly lit, time-stamped, sent to Rachel and to my own email, and into a cloud folder I labeled with the date. Then I went back downstairs. "I'd like you to leave," I said to Margaret, "tonight. And I'd like you to understand that I will be speaking to an attorney in the morning about the forged signature and the unauthorized account. What happens after that depends on what you choose to do between now and then." "You're bluffing," she said. "I have never bluffed in my life. Ask your son." She looked at Daniel. He looked at the floor. In that silence, in the full, resonant quality of it, in the way he once again, for the final time, chose not to speak, something in me completed a calculation I had been running since November. He had known. Not just about the conversations. He had known about the account. He had set it up. He had been routing money into it for 8 months and never said a single word. And he was standing in the doorway of the house I had built and still could not look at me and say, "I was wrong. I am sorry. I choose you." He said nothing. Margaret left. I did not sleep that night. I sat at the kitchen table with a glass of water and the folder and let myself feel, fully and without editing, everything I had been storing since the autumn. The dinner table questions, the listings left on the counter, the browser history I was not meant to find, the slow erosion of the ease that had once been the best thing about us. I let myself grieve the specific, irreplaceable thing that had been lost. Not the marriage, not yet, but the version of Daniel I had believed in. The man who would always, if it came to it, stand on the right side of the room. That man had turned out to be partially real, partially a story I had told myself. And sitting in the kitchen at 2 a.m, I allowed myself to mourn him, quietly and completely, before deciding what to do next. What I decided was, fight. Patricia Hollis was direct, expensive, and exactly right for the job. I sat in her office at 10 the next morning and explained everything from the beginning, laying the photographs on her desk one by one. She listened without interrupting. Then, "The forged signature alone is sufficient to pursue charges. The fraudulent account is a separate civil matter. How would you like to proceed?" I told her exactly how. What followed over the next 3 weeks was quiet and procedural and extraordinarily effective. Patricia filed a formal fraud complaint with the county attorney's office. She notified Robert Calloway that the letter of intent he had received was fraudulent and that any action based on it would expose him to personal liability. She initiated civil proceedings on the unauthorized account. And she sent Margaret a letter, formal, precise, utterly devoid of sentiment, outlining her legal exposure and giving her 30 days to respond. The response came in under 2 weeks. Through her own hastily acquired attorney, Margaret agreed to a full civil settlement, written acknowledgement of the fraudulent document, formal withdrawal of the letter of intent, closure of the unauthorized account with complete restitution of $4,200, and a legally binding restriction on any future involvement with my assets without my written consent. She signed it. I imagine she signed it at a kitchen table not entirely unlike my own, and I imagine she signed it with her careful posture and her tight chignon. And I imagine that in that moment she understood, perhaps for the first time, that she had miscalculated the person she was dealing with. Tanya's mortgage remained Tanya's problem. In searching for a solution without my house as a resource, it emerged, or was revealed, depending on how generously you read the situation, that Margaret had been sitting on a piece of land in another state that she had never once mentioned to anyone. She sold it. The debt was cleared, which told me, more plainly than anything Patricia had argued, that using my house had never been a necessity. It had been a choice. There had always been another option, I had simply been the more convenient one, someone calculated to be easier to manage than to ask. That calculation was the last one she ever made about me. Daniel and I separated for 2 months. We saw a counselor, a good one, direct and unhurried, who did not tell us what to do, but helped us understand, with uncomfortable precision, exactly what had happened and why. What I learned in that room was something I had suspected, but not yet fully articulated. Daniel had not married me to betray me. He had also, simultaneously, never fully separated himself from the architecture of his childhood, which said that his mother's emotional reality was the weather system everyone lived inside of. He had done what he did, not out of cruelty, but out of a trained, lifelong inability to stand in the space between his mother's want and another person's need and say, no, not this time, not at this cost. Understanding that was not the same as excusing it, but it was enough, after 2 months of honest and painful work, to decide the marriage was worth rebuilding, on conditions that were not negotiable. His mother was no longer welcome in my home without my explicit invitation. Our finances were formally separated beyond the household account. Any communication with his family regarding our property required my knowledge and consent. He agreed to every condition without negotiating a single word. Whether that was guilt or genuine reckoning, I watched carefully over the following months, and what I found was that it was both, which is, perhaps, the most honest version of human accountability available to us. Margaret and I have not spoken since the night I asked her to leave. I do not expect we will. Some bridges are not burned so much as quietly, deliberately dismantled, brick by careful brick, until what remains is simply the river, moving on the way it always has, indifferent to whatever once stood over it. It is September now. The apple tree has done what it always does, produced more fruit than we can possibly use, in a stubborn, generous abundance that cares nothing about whether the season was difficult or easy. I made jam last weekend, 3 jars, amber-colored, smelling of warm sugar and late summer, and the particular sweetness of things that have been left alone long enough to ripen fully. I lined them up on the kitchen counter and stood for a long moment, looking at them in the afternoon light that falls through the window above the sink at the same angle it has always fallen, since before this house was mine, since before this was any kind of story at all. I own this house. My name is on the deed, and for the first time in a long time, that fact sits in my chest exactly the way it did when I first got the keys. Not as something I have to defend, not as something I embrace to protect at every turn, but simply as what it is, something earned, something real, something belonging to me in the most complete and unambiguous sense of the word. No folder, no forged signature, no woman with a tight chignon and a folder full of other people's decisions can change that. I know that now, with the certainty that no longer requires any effort to maintain. I held one of the jars up to the window. The amber went deep and warm and clear, and through it I could see the tree and the sky and the long reach of the afternoon already beginning its slow turn toward evening. I put the jar down. I went back to work. Some things, once you've built them, are simply yours. And some lessons, once you've paid for them in full, you never have to pay for again.